There was some old-time movie stars in the U.S. named Abbott and Costello. You know if you heard of them? Abbott and Costello. Okay. Anyway, Abbott and Costello. And you could say, well, Abbott and Costello and Charlie Chaplin are from New York and London, respectively. And then you got to treat Abbott and Costello as a unit. Okay, you could imagine something like that. But in a neutral context where we know, because everybody knows, which play is this from? Midsummer Night's Dream. Okay, very good. Everybody knows that Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia have no inherent grouping. Okay, well, anyway, don't worry about that. But you can construct examples where you have no idea who the hell these people are. And so you should have no inherent grouping. And so, okay, but now we say 2 apples were given out, but I don't know to who. Who was given an apple? Okay. And now here, you can explicitly force. What is your name? Rogerio. You can explicitly force the Rogerio scenario. Okay? You can say, who was given an apple? I said 2 were given out. This is a very Roper-esque scenario where you have the pictures and it's very clear. 2 apples. Okay, I cannot say Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia respectively. It just doesn't work. But I can say Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia respectively. Or Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia respectively. Okay, those pipes, you see these pipes? That's the name in English anyway for the symbol on the typewriter for people who use Unix and Linux, a pipe. These single pipes mean 1 amount of boundary strength, and 2 pipes mean stronger amount of boundary strength. So I'll read those to you. Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia respectively, or Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia respectively. But not Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia respectively. That doesn't work. I'll give you another example which is a little bit clearer because maybe you don't have the word respectively in your language, but you do, suppose you do have the word both. That's even better. Yeah? Who wrote an essay? And then I say both. This is great. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Or both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Let's look at this. Okay? But I cannot say who wrote an essay. I say there's, okay, who wrote an essay? I don't even need to set up a picture with 2 apples. Even the word both. I don't need any fancy artists, you know, Luli had some luck with some artists with QuickTime. I don't even need, if I have both in the language, an artist. Just using the word both already knocks out a prosody of both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Let's do this then. Let's see how this works. I've already pre-recorded these sentences for you, but that's the only thing you'll need to do. You can try this in the privacy of your own home anytime you like. Okay. So what are you going to do? Let's just play this. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. All right, let's pretend I didn't record this. I'll show you all the steps. Ready? You're watching, you're taking notes. I mean, if you don't care, you don't have, but if you want to do this, take notes. Okay, now you go to Prat, and you go to New, and you record a mono sound. I know that in this day and age, we think that stereo and 3D is better, but we just want mono here, okay? And now I hit record. Now I have to make, Miriam, what's called a text grid. Very important. Okay. And I'll tell you why. So now we do the following. We go to the little tab that says annotate. And then we go to text grid here. And now a little window is going to come up. And it says, how many tiers do you want? a tier is a kamada, a tier, a level. I only want one for now. Let's just call it duration. Which of these are point tiers? None of them. We don't want point tiers. We don't like point tiers. None of them. Everyone following along? You could call that, you don't have to call that duration. You can call that kaitanu, as long as you know that it's duration. Okay? Now, we go here and we click on sound and we click on this and we view and edit them together. Like this. We highlight them both. And now we edit them. Okay. Now, we have a lot of information here. Let's go sentence by sentence. After I show you this, we take a break. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Okay? By the way, I'm going to call this here. So, we have both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Okay? I'm going to call them, I'm going to rename these people A, B, and C right now. Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. And now what we have actually is both A and B and C, or both A and B and C. And now I'm going to do something else. The conjoined guys I'm just going to call X. So now we're going to compare the AX structure and the XC structure. Does everyone understand? AX is A and some junk, B and C. And XC is some junk, A and B and C. All right? If you want to study this stuff, you need to know these conventions. It's not too hard. So we're going to compare AX and XC. Okay. So now what do we do? All right, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this portion. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. What, is that AX or XC? Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. AX, very good. Okay. Now, what am I going to do here? These little buttons are very important zoom buttons. Imagine I'm on a video camera. I'm going to zoom into the selection here. All right, now all I see is that first sentence. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. All right. Now, I'm going to start segmenting in the text grid. To do that, it's a little bit annoying. You click on here, right on this line, until you get a dot. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. So I'm going to start by trying to put my first bound, and this is an iterative process, okay? But I'm going to start by trying to put my first one here. Let's see if that's roughly right. Both Lysander. Okay? And now I'm going to type in here both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Okay, obviously that's not good enough, but that's my first cut. Now I'm going to try to make it a little bit better. And Demetrius and Hermia. Okay, so now I'm going to find both Lysander and Demetrius. Okay, I'm almost at Demetrius. Now I'll put another one here. And now I'm going to call this Hermia. And here I'm going to rename this in just Demetrius. And Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander. Okay, that's good enough for now, right? What do you think? Should we cut out the both? Should we cut out the ands? It's going to be very hard. Now that's important, by the way. Some of you syntacticians are going to say, but the and. But of course, if you know your syntax, you'll know that our structure of and P usually is like this. Lysander and Demetrius, and these guys are a constituent. So it actually makes sense to group those together instead of grouping the and here. Does everyone understand that? I group the and with the second constituent, not the first. There are many, 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 many reasons to do that, okay? You won't be able to cut the and out. the way that humans phrase things, and is a kind of clitic. Now, it may be different in Portuguese. João e Maria. But I think that the E goes with Maria, not with João. Okay? So, you know, I'm going to leave it like that. But you know what? Okay. And Demetrius. Okay. Now, why did I make that text grid? The reason I made that text grid. Okay, now I'm going to close this. I'm going to close this. I'm going to close this. All right. Now, suppose I just open the text grid. What does a text grid look like? Anyone know? Just a bunch of numbers without the sound. And the point is, I can mess with this text grid without changing the sound file. So let's say I make my annotations and I send them to you. And you say, you know what? I'm sorry. I think the boundary between Lysander and Demetrius is a little bit to the right. You can change that without changing the sound file. And if you say, wait a minute, I don't believe a word that Andrew came up with, send me the text grids. You see where I made the cuts. Because a lot of people just go into Part and they say, okay, let me record. Okay, fine. I made my recordings. Here I am. I open them up. And I recorded it. Let's look at Lysander. And Demetrius and Hermia. Oh, and Demetrius and Hermia. Oh, great. That's 1.38 seconds. Great. Now let me go home. But you want to remember where you put the markers. That's why you need to do text grids. So that you, yourself, in 10 years, who's a different person than you are today, of course, or anybody else, can verify where you put the boundaries. Okay? Does everyone understand why that's important? You would need to do that anyway. Suppose your battery dies and you want to go back and remember where you need to do that. You need to do that. Okay. So now let's look at this. All right. So now, of course, we don't have our nice, buttery, simple pitch track here. Things look pretty chaotic. There are two things that I have to say to that. One of them is that Part does not know me. Part does not know what the pitch of my voice is. So I have to tell Part a little bit about myself. I have to tell Part, you know what? Instead of going between 70 and 200, why don't you go between 70 and 250? And now you see the lines are a little bit better. It had put the roof too low. It didn't know that I use especially when Lysander is the topic, I get very expressive, and I use the whole range of, okay? So now we can look at this. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. All right. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. All right, now let's look at this. I hit stop. This is the AX structure. Both Lysander and Demetrius good. And Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. And Hermia. Now, here are a couple of things we can do. Let's look at the AX structure here. Both Lysander. What's going on at the end of Lysander there? What do you see in the picture that's happening at the end of Lysander? A high rise and then a fall. Okay, but that's sharp. You go up to have a sharp, but Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Okay, now just inside Demetrius and Hermia, let's look at the pitch of those. Now I'm going to show you something else you can do. You can go inside each of these little windows and you can say, what is the maximum pitch there? 229. Okay, let's write that down. 229. Okay. And what about for Hermia?
And Hermia.
206. Okay? So we see that, just one second. We see that C is lower than B. Now let's just quickly compare that to A and B and C. I'm going to zoom in here.
Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia.
Okay, now we zoom into this selection. We put something approximately here.
Both Lysander.
Oh, we'll move it over a little bit.
Both Lysander. Both Lysander.
All the way to here.
Both Lysander.
A little bit further over.
And Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia.
All right. Now this is A and B and then C. Let's look at the relative pitch of B and C. 214.
And Hermia.
198. Let's listen to that. That's very interesting. Let's listen to that.
Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia.
And there you got a full and.
Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. I hit stop.
Is that clear to everybody, more or less? So what we're seeing is that within a group, let me show you this abstractly. We have both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia versus both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Yeah? So what's going on here seems to be that the and is shorter when it's inside a constituent and longer when it is at the edge of a constituent. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia, beginning of a phrase. Lysander and Demetrius, Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Okay? Here we have the compression. So not only can we measure the pitch, this is the last thing that I think we really overdo for a break, that I want to show you is that you can also measure the duration of these. Okay, so let's look at that.
And Demetrius and Demetrius and Demetrius and Demetrius and Demetrius and Demetrius and Demetrius.
Okay. Not a huge difference in this particular case, but in this case we have A and B and C.
Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia.
Okay?
Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia.
Both Lysander and Demetrius. Demetrius there is at the end of a
Demetrius.
phrase, 934 milliseconds. Demetrius is at the beginning of a phrase, both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia, and inside a phrase, shorter. Here it's shorter, 912, here 934. Let me show you on the board so that this is clearer. When we have both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia, longer, because it's at the end of a constituent. Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Demetrius is shorter. Okay? We will come back to this again after the break. What this exhibits is one of the most robust cues, and now we've seen two of them. We're going to look at them again. But this is one of the easiest ones to measure. This is what is called phrase final lengthening. Phrase final lengthening. Let me go back to the slides and show you that. In this case, both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Lysander is at the end of a phrase, it's going to be longer here than it is here. So we're going to, not only should we compare Demetrius, here Demetrius is before 2 pipes, hence longer, here before 1, hence shorter, but also Lysander, here before 2 pipes and hence longer, here before 1 pipe and hence shorter. We need to compare all of those. And I'll show you that after the break. But the point is that we're going to use phrase final lengthening. Now, what some of you are probably asking me is, what phrase? What do you mean phrase? What kind of phrase? Before we break, I have one question for you. What do I mean when I say phrase final lengthening? What kind of a phrase am I talking about? Lad 86 was the first to discuss the question of whether there could be recursiveness in phonology. Remember, that's our second question. And this all started with looking at a set of labels which organize the prosodic hierarchy. So this is the, for example, structure that he gives for the sentence, my brother's daughter is 2 years old.
My brother's daughter is 2 years old.
Okay, now my brother's daughter is 2 years old. Now, again, this looks very much like what we drew for Apalachicola there. There's some terminology here. The important point is at the top, there's what's called the major phrase, MP. And major phrase is said to be the constituent that's one of the largest, highest levels, if you will, of what's called the prosodic hierarchy. So that the same way in syntax we might say that the highest level of syntactic structure is the CP, and then the TP, and then the VP, or if you were at my presentation last week, maybe force P and fin P, and then tense P, and so forth. His idea is that we have things like major phrase, which dominate a level which is called the tone group. And then you can have the weak or strong tone group. If you listen to that sentence, my brother's daughter is 2 years old. We have intuitively the grouping of 2 units. My brother's daughter, which is the subject noun phrase, is 2 years old, which is the predicate. So far this looks, well, big deal. This looks just like what we have in Russian grammar. Theme and rime. The subject and the predicate, тема рема, and each one gets its own group. Of course, one of them is stronger than the other, and that tends to be, in this case, the predicate, my brother's daughter is 2 years old. And then within each of those, there are pitch accents. PA is for pitch accent. And pitch accents go on specific syllables of specific words. So my brother's daughter is 2 years old. Okay? So in that case, for example, the word years doesn't have a pitch accent, but 2 does. Okay? So that's very important, that in a sense, the reason this is called a hierarchy is because the places where the tones go is determined by the lexical stress within the word. Yeah? That's very important. So the word brother in isolation has stress on bruh, not on ther. And if that word brother's daughter then goes in a phrase where it itself is going to bear a pitch accent because it's a subject noun phrase and blah, 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 that pitch accent is going to go on bruh. That is to say, even the higher level syntactic and semantic information needs to anchor and dock on the stressed syllable that's lexically specified for that word. So we see an interaction between the lexical specification of what can be a pitch accented syllable and the syntactic structure which determines where it's going to be. Now this, by the way, is very, 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 very important in languages such as Japanese. Because in languages such as Japanese, and I'll play you some examples on Thursday of Japanese, it's the same thing except that words have certain syllables which can bear pitch accents. Yeah? But then some words just simply don't have any pitch accents. But one of the things that we're seeing here, my brother's daughter is 2 years old. Sometimes it's easier to whistle this. You know, we get so distracted by the segmental and lexical material, but then you say, yeah? And so you see there that you really have 4 pitch accents. My brother's daughter is 2 years old. And you can single out which ones correspond to the high ones and which ones correspond to the falls. And okay, very good. So this is the basic grouping that Ladd assigns for the prosodic hierarchy, where there are the level of the pitch accents. They themselves are grouped, strong and weak, somewhat more abstractly into tone groups, and tone groups in turn are grouped into major phrases. Okay. So far, so good? Tem 2 anos de idade is 2 years old. 2 years old. 2 anos de idade. That part's the same. My brother's daughter is 2 years old. No, that's not what I said. That's not the way I said it. My brother's daughter is 2 years old. I'll play. That's why we got the recordings. Okay, let's listen to the recordings.
My brother's daughter is 2 years old.
This is almost like reading out a story. No. This is a very neutral one. This is like the beginning of a story. The intonation I gave here and the intonation that is usually presented in linguistics examples, and of course that's one of the reasons why there are the chest thumpers that like narratives. I'm just poking at the documentation people. But, you know, sometimes people say, well, you got to do stuff from narratives and real, because these things, which they sometimes do come from isolated examples, which are supposed to be the introductions to stories. So this intonation that I gave it here is the intonation that you would have at the beginning of a story. Let me tell you a story. My brother's daughter is 2 years old. She walked down the street one day, and that's the neutral intonation. That's storytelling out of the blue. That's not a corrective or, you know, no, you schmuck, she's not 5. She's 2 years old. This is an out of the blue intonation.
My brother's daughter is 2 years old.
You may be reading more into my intonation than is intended. That's all I can say. It may sound so storybook-like that you think I'm tirando sarro. But it's not. That's just storybook intonation. And I would say it's this intonation on the predicate is largely the same as Portuguese. Tem 2 anos de idade is 2 years old. Tem 2 anos de idade. So let's go with the first case. Is 2 years old. Very similar. Okay, there are some differences in the pitch envelope, but the relative pitches are the same. What I want to focus on a little bit more is the relative pitches and which words are accented and which words are not accented. So in Portuguese, the word anos is also not accented. So no matter how much people sing, they don't sing on words like years. That's important. That's important. Now, let's get to the first part. My brother's daughter is 2 years old. This is very interesting. I want to spend more time on this. I think with the predicate there, we're, you know, talking about whether, you know, fine differences between clarinet and saxophone. But the predicate there, but the subject is very interesting. Okay, my brother's daughter is 2 years old. There we have a higher pitch on brother. Now, let's hear that in Portuguese. Here we have more on irmão. Okay, that is important. That I do want to focus on. Now, where's Tom? There is some discussion in the literature about the fact that the possessives in English of the genitive possessive S, like my brother's daughter, come from an underlying structure like the daughter of my brother. Okay? If this is true, this means that everything that we saw in Terue's presentation and everything we've been talking about might need to be slightly rethought. Yeah? There is some evidence that suggests that things like John's daughter really comes in English from something like the daughter of John. Okay? Larson and Cho have a paper in which they look at the we don't have the time to go into it today, I'll bring it on Thursday, but in which they look at the interpretation of words like former, not for words like daughter, but John's, think of the example he uses. Let me grab it real fast, I have it right here. John's former house. So the argument, we have to look at this in the syntax if you guys want to go into this. John's former house is a house that formerly belongs to John. It doesn't mean John's thing that is a former house. Yeah? If you have a pile of rubble, a bulldozer came and knocked it over, well, that's a former house. But John's former house is not interpreted that way. It's interpreted as the house that formerly belonged to John. Something like the former house of John. The former house of John, and not John's former house. Does everyone understand that? Let me show you a very Mickey Mouse syntax. I know you guys all like Orlando. Very Mickey Mouse syntax of what this would be like. This would be something like the former house of John. This is the former house of John, and not John's thing, which is a former house. Okay? Subtle argumentation. Tom.
I want to comment on your earlier remark, although this one is pertinent to the question of this thing you're pointing out is pertinent to the question of whether the first possessive has exactly the same set of possible meanings as recursive possessives. I think Barbara Partee has some stuff on this too. Let me see, you get cases like my favorite movie and things like that. I don't have all the examples at hand. But just to not let something else go by, the argument that the prenominal possessive is derived from the postnominal possessive has been made by Kyle Johnson and other people too. And one of the ambiguities is that you can have the house of John or the house of Johns. And if you have that apostrophe S, then that seems to be the one that really moves up to the left. And interestingly enough, basically, Bart Hullebrunst and I, in the paper we just wrote, have observed that in acquisition, the recursive possessives seem to come in around 5 to 6. And the recursive compounds come in at the same point. So if you have coffee maker maker, that essentially comes from make coffee, make something that makes coffee. And you move something to the left to get coffee maker, and then you move that whole thing to the left again to get coffee maker maker. The same logic will apply to John's friend's house, where you have to do 2 movements to the left. So if that's true, it could be an explanation for why the recursive possessives and the recursive compounds are coming in at the same time, much later.
Yeah, so this is a whole range of interesting evidence to my mind, let me just add my 2 cents here. One of the most exciting aspects of language acquisition is not simply to say, look, 4-year-olds can do this, but 3-year-olds can't. That's good to know. But the kind of logic that Tom just described, which is also something very big in William Snyder's work, which is to say, look, at the same age that construction X comes in, construction Y comes in, and that suggests that X and Y might involve the same mechanism. I really don't care if kids get recursive possessives at 5 or 6 or 7, but I do care if they get them at a different age than they get compounds. So that is very important. And that kind of evidence, I think, is precisely the kind that might suggest that you have the same underlying structure. The facts about this, the house of Johns, is also quite interesting. With pronouns, obviously it's a little more complicated, right? The house of my just doesn't work. This John's, the house of my or the house of mine, a little more the house of ours, a little more complicated, although that might be an apostrophe S. So it's very interesting. But what I want to point out to is suppose that we take all of this evidence that Tom and Larson and Cho and apparently Kyle Johnson and Barbara Partee have mustered together very seriously, say that John's house comes from the house of John underlyingly. That would suggest that the structure in Portuguese is the more underlying or basic structure, and hence that the differences in intonation we find could be due to the fact that the underlying structure is really, in English, really comes from the Portuguese structure, yeah? So that you might think that what Miriam brings up is very relevant, namely the fact that o filho do meu irmão has more stress on irmão, whereas my brother's daughter... Como que é? Como que é? And my brother's daughter, where brother had a higher pitch than daughter, that you have the same thing going on. You have the higher pitch on brother, even though they're in different linear orders, because underlyingly they come from that base, more embedded position. Okay? And this relates to something that we will hopefully come back to again. It doesn't tie into the question of intonation and its relation to recursivity, but many of you will probably not be able to go very far in life without bumping into something called Cinque's nuclear stress rule. The NSR, nuclear stress rule. Now, nuclear has nothing to do with weapons, although it took me a long time to figure that out. Nuclear there means at the sentential or phrasal level, where does the sentential or phrasal stress go? And Cinque's basic claim there is that it goes on the most deeply embedded constituent. Now, deeply embedded within what? That's the key question, which we'll come back to. But if you say, you know, John bought a book. Book has more stress than John. Why? Answer, book is more deeply embedded in the tree. It's lower in the tree than John. My brother's daughter, if brother comes from a lower position in the tree, we can make sense of that. I don't think this has been studied in a cross-linguistic way very seriously. Even Wagner's paper here, which is a relative state of the art, says much more needs to be done about the intonation of PPs in languages with genitive S. Now, what I want to show you right now, though, is we had an excellent question during the break from Rafael Sinclair Braga about how cross-linguistic is the declination. And so I want to show you right now some data from Kuikuru. So if you were here last week, you already saw this data. Okay. This is the chief's canoes paddles drawing. Okay, but it's really something like the, well, there are these relative markers, which I haven't parsed out here. You know, and there's a very open question about their analysis. But all of these ts and gs and ss are relative markers, linkers, if you like. Yeah, and so this is something like the chief of his, the canoe of its, the paddle of its, the drawing. It's also a little more complicated because this thing also appears at the very end. Yeah, if you have the chief's canoes paddles drawing, it's not the chief's canoes paddles drawings. So why the hell do you have this relative marker at the end of the last noun in Kuikuru? That has not been understood yet. But what I want you to do is look at the intonation here. This is a recursive structure from Kuikuru, the chief's canoes paddles drawing, and if you remember, I'll show you in the next example from Bruna. I just stole these from Bruna. I said, give me your PowerPoint. I just stole these. But that's fine. All I did is put them in Prat. She could have done this herself very easily. And I put them in Prat, and you see the declination. The declination goes like this. And you listen to it. Oops. Listen one more time. Okay? This is the pitch track that I extracted right away. Descends very beautifully. Now, there is this jump here. And that relates to the topic which Bruna discussed, and there's a paper about this by Bruna and Glauber da Silva, it was published as, I believe. And that one talks about the fact that in the very first merge, the stress, which is normally penultimate in Koikuru, jumps to the final syllable. And then this ends with a vowel, and this starts with a vowel, and so the two, there's no clear separation. And so what you're seeing here is actually probably the final pitch here that's been pushed over a little bit. But then from then on, it's all downhill. Now, look at this. This is great. This is the Indians, chiefs, paddles, canoes drawing. I didn't make up the example. Downhill. Okay. Now, and then Raphael said, how universal is the global declination? I said, I don't know. But let's look at Koikuru. Now, if I just showed you declination of recursive possessives, that shows nothing. It shows something. But you cannot publish a paper without showing the contrast with coordination. Luckily, we have that. This is the paddle of the Indian and the canoe of the Indian and the drawing of the chief. The paddle of the Indian and the drawing of the canoe. Okay. Those are just A, B's, and C's, and D's for all we care about. The point is they're coordinated here. Okay. Now, you hear there's a very nice buttery conjunction in Koikuru. Okay? And after that, it goes downhill again. So let's listen to that one more time. Okay? Now, here's the one with conjunction. So we have the and then downhill again. Here's the pitch track. Nikogo and downhill on. Pause, big pause, downhill again. Okay, I hope you can see that from the back. I'll make that bigger if you wish. And all of these examples will be in the Dropbox for you to play with. We open this here, we open it up here, we take this, we say, draw that for me. Okay, and you see, here we go downhill. Here we have this little spike with the O. Start back up again and go downhill. Okay. That is an excellent point. That is an excellent point. And there is a word lurking here that I didn't gloss. And that is this word gehale. And this word gehale means also. So this means, you know, the Indian's canoe and the drawing of the paddle, he also brought. Gehale. Let me go back to my slides where I had that a little clearer. Okay, now here we go. The Indian's paddle and the canoe's drawing brought also him. Now, what the cargas de agua is that also? What is that also doing there? That's an interesting question. If this were just straightforward conjunction, you wouldn't need an also. I can't really say, I brought, let's say, the Indian's paddle and the canoe's drawing. Let's say, I say, the Indian's paddle and the canoe's drawing fell on my head. Fine. The Indian's paddle and the canoe's drawing fell on my head. Shh, 1 second, 1 second. The Indian's paddle and the canoe's drawing fell on my head. Fine. Ouch. Two things. The Indian's paddle and the canoe's drawing also fell on my head. When I throw in also there, that's strange. Okay? That suggests an ellipsis type or a right node raising structure. And that, if that's true, then the structure here is something like the Indian's paddle he brought and the canoe's drawing he brought two with ellipsis. Now, if that's true, then the syntax, the real syntax, which has ellipsis going on, and the prosody are perfectly aligned. So I thank you for your question, but that's why I said to you, when you said it looks like the syntax and the prosody are not aligned, I said, wait, what is the syntax? And the fact that there is an also word there really means the plot is much thicker than we thought. And that comes up in the Karaja experiments. We're going to look at the Karaja experiments on Thursday, and that comes up in the Pirahan cases with Pi. Every time we have also, that is maybe not such an innocent little word. Because in English, I can't say, John and Mary took my class. Fine. John and Mary also took my class. If you hear that, you say, there's got to be more structure going on here. You got to know the language very well. But you don't have to know the language that well to notice right away that if you didn't know what gehake was, and you didn't know what on was, you thought, oh, maybe that's some case marker or a commutative or who knows what the hell that is. They have very different intonations. That's one of the very simple points I want to make for you today, is that even if you're doing monolingual or different field work on a language you don't know, you haven't done a complete analysis of, and you don't know. And so you say, what does that mean? And they say, well, the Indians paddled, and there was a canoe, and they brought, and God damn it, it's confusing, where's my coffee? But you have the intonation, and you see that those are two separate phrases. Whereas in the other case, strictly descending. Okay? In a sense, what I'm doing here is just a very, what you might call a call to arms. That sounds a little bit militant, but an envoy for, to just try to throw open these tools and see what happens. And look at it very quickly. And you see that we can use global declination, Rafael, even on a language which I did not know very much about, and I just opened two examples and we found very clear difference here. Okay? And here's the other pitch track, I'm sorry. Okay. Two peaks. Two peaks. One peak. Okay? So of course, Anna, you want to go and do this with lots of examples and fine measurements and text grids that you share with your friends, and you argue, wait, no, the boundary's here, not there, move it to the left. You want to do all of that work. But as a first pass, seeing whether there are two peaks at equal height versus one single peak is a very good indicator of what your intuitions might be. Now, while you guys were having a break, and I'm going to play on Thursday some examples from Japanese, from Karaja, and from Piraha. Uli very kindly provided me some recordings from Piraha, but without the glosses, so I'll need those too. My
brothers.
I want to show you very briefly the measurements I made on the fly from these Lysander examples, and then we'll go to the theory so that you can do the readings and make some sense of them, and we'll wrap up. Okay. So, in the first case here, remember, this was the A and B and C, both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia, versus both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Two differences to look for. One is the duration, what we call phrase final lengthening. Both Lysander and Demetrius, 1151, we can go back in Prod, I'll show you exactly where that is if you want. Got it measured. I'll give you the text grids, you measure it. Both Lysander and Demetrius, 1151. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia, 921. Okay, that's a big difference, by the way. I don't know how comfortable you guys are with milliseconds, but that is a big difference. 200 milliseconds is a big difference. So we have a lot more lengthening of Demetrius when it's at the end of a phrase. And Rogério was asking me, he's very interested in the mathematical expressions, 3 plus 5 times 2 versus 3 plus 5 times 2. You hear that already. 3 plus 5 times 2. 3 plus 5 times 2. Okay? This phrase final lengthening is you can even get it with mathematical expressions. Now, sometimes a lot of people sort of restrict themselves to mathematical expressions because they're a lot easier than human language, which has these alsos and the focus and the irony. No, of course she's too, you dummy. Well, you can't be ironic with mathematical expressions. So sometimes people stick to very formulaic expressions to look at this stuff. In the early years of computer science, speech recognition looked at 3 plus 2 times 5 versus 3 plus 2 times 5, probably because they wanted to tell the computer to do the equations for them instead of feeding the punch cards. And there are some papers on that, one by O'Malley and somebody, and another by Shaughnessy. And they, in the 70s, they looked at sort of whether computers could tell 3 plus 5 times 2 versus 3 plus 5 times 2. Okay, so we have the phrase final lengthening. There's no real mystery there. There's just a general pattern of life, and Anna, that would be very challenging to somehow anchor in a theory of human laziness, that people get longer at the end of a sentence because you think they've run out of steam. So it's just another cue that's used. You know, we grab whatever cues are possible. It could have been the opposite. You could have said that the first thing in a thing is the longest, and the last one is the shortest. That would have worked just as well if a super engineer was designing things. But anyway, these are the facts. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia versus both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Okay? And you can hear the recordings. I didn't exaggerate them too much. Now, what about the pitch? Okay, this is interesting. Look at this. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. 170 on Hermia. Okay? That's 63 less than it was at Demetrius. Okay, fine. Now, both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia, there it's 146, and that's a drop of 95, a bigger drop. All right. Now, we're going to spend the rest of the time looking theoretically at why that is. So, what these facts here show you is that within a constituent, you have global declination. Here, Demetrius and Hermia are a constituent, and so Hermia is lower. Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Hermia is not a constituent with Lysander, so it doesn't drop. Both Lysander and Demetrius, that's done, and Hermia. Hermia is in her own little world. Both Lysander and Demetrius and Hermia. Their Hermia is grouped with Demetrius, so she is going to suffer global declination. And that's what the facts show. It's got an absolute and a relative value lower in this case versus this case. Again, the intonation is providing clues to the syntax. Now, one of the reasons why Michael Wagner's work is interesting is because he conceptually says it's not necessarily that the intonation is providing clues to the syntax, but also that the syntax sort of may sometimes configure itself in such a way to make the prosody more transparent. Okay, let's look at this a little more theoretically in depth, and then we'll wrap up. Where were we?
My brother's...
Okay. Here's a formal theory of downstep. Now, the word downstep, okay, I said global declination. Declination is a term that is used by basically people, descriptive people working on English since the My Fair Lady days. Okay? But there was a very nice moment in the history of linguistics whereby this is interesting, history of linguistics, whereby some people working on West African languages, Will Laban, Edwin Williams, actually, the syntactician, John Goldsmith, were working on West African languages, tone languages. And then Janet Pierre Humbert and Mark Liberman came along working on English, and they used the theory that was developed for African languages. A lot of people say, generative grammar, you take English and you apply it to other languages. If you look at the history of intonation research, it all came from studies of African languages. And the term downstep is a that comes from African language tradition. When you have high tones in African languages, Yoruba, and you have Agbo Nino Bolazi, you have the highs gradually downstepping. That, if you ever look in the literature, you'll see H, and then you'll see an H with a little minus on it. Or sometimes an H with an exclamation point on it. That's terrible terminology, but that's what they use. This means an H which is downstepped relative to a preceding H. And the term downstep is now used for English, which is not a tone language, not a lexical tone language, borrowing from African languages. So I will use, in the literature, you'll see the word downstep. Okay? But if you look in the old stuff by Halliday or Bollinger or even older stuff, they'll use declination. But downstep, okay, fine. So, one of the things that was really interesting, and maybe Uli can tell us more about this, I don't know very much about the word but. The word but basically means and plus a lot of pragmatics, right? Yeah. So most semanticists treat it truth conditionally just like and. But it's and plus some pragmatic stuff, okay? Now one of the things that Ladd shows, he contrasts sentences like the following. Ryan has a lot more money, but Warren is a stronger campaigner and Allen has more popular policies. Versus, Allen is a stronger campaigner and Ryan has more popular policies, but Warren has a lot more money. And he wants to show that actually but induces a stronger boundary than and. You probably can intuit this in your own Portuguese, you know. Eu almoço arroz e feijão e depois tomo café. Eu almoço arroz e feijão, mas depois tomo café. Mas has some stronger break, a stronger pause, stronger break, a stronger, okay? It's got more weight to it. Okay. And so what Ladd was looking at there is the fact that when you have but, you have a stronger boundary afterwards. So that you're going to have a stronger boundary before be here, yeah, of course, yeah, then here, and your C is also going to have a stronger boundary than your C internally here. Okay, now, let's look at this. I hope you can see this chart. Here's where we start to see some recursive application of the syntax to the tones. Okay, so the idea is the following. At each binary node, you have high and low. So you have an high on A, and then because of global declination, because of downstep, the next thing over is going to be lower. But that happens recursively. So A, and then downstep this. A and B, downstep this. But then within here, high, and downstep this. And then within here, downstep this. Does everybody see this? So what, okay, now I have a question for you all. What does this predict about C in the one in A versus the one in B? Okay, I know it's terrible that I have A's as my example numbers and as in my meta language and in my object language. I have A, B, C here, and I have A and B as the example numbers. Okay, anyway, let's call this 3A and 3B. And these are A, B, C. These are A zone, B zone, C zone. Okay? So, what about Cezinho? Cezão. Cezão. Is that going to be more downstepped in 3A or in 3B? Which one will show less downstep? 3A or 3B? Here, we have two, this one is going to be lower because we have 2 degrees of lowering. We have 2 instructions to lower. Lower here as a consequence of being the second member of this phrase in suffering down step, you're going to go suffer down step because you're the second in this whole phrase. And then in here, suffer down step again, twice. Here it only suffers down step once. The formal theory of down step says, whenever I have a phrase with two nodes, the second one is going to be lower than the first. If I recursively have a phrase with two nodes, and then the second one's lower than the first, and then inside the second one inside the second one is going to be lower, even lower. Whereas here, I have two phrases, and I have the second one, which is just the second one. I happen to have a second one inside the first one, but I didn't ask you about that. I asked you about the second one, which only goes one step of down step. Recursivamente, cada vez que tem dois nódulos, no segundo, o segundo vai sofrer down step. Abaixamento da entonação. Então, essa ramificação todo vai sofrer down step. Aí dentro dessa ramificação vai aplicar down step de novo. Então, essa aqui no C sofreu down step duas vezes. Ou seja, ele foi abaixado duas vezes, enquanto esse C só sofreu down step uma vez. And that's what we saw in the measurements that we looked at. In the case in Hermia, we had, not with but we had Demeter and Lysandra and Hermia versus Demeter and Lysandra and Hermia. And the C was lower in that case than it was in that case. So this, in the but case, this C is going to be even higher, actually. So let me read these to you. Ryan has a lot more money, but Warren is a stronger campaigner, and Allen has more popular policies. That was C. Popular policies. You heard where that was? Down somewhere in the 95 hertz range. I don't know exactly where, okay? And then, but the other one, Allen is a stronger campaigner, and Ryan has more popular policies, but Warren has a lot more money. You see that whole last part is higher now because it's this structure. Now, the very last thing I'll show you is the following. This is very interesting. Look at this. This is great. I love this. Listen to this. I'll show you a magic trick now, actually. This is going to be a magic trick.
The book on the table was a gift from my mother. The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother.
Okay. So I have a parenthetical here. The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother. Yeah? That thing in the middle is a parenthetical. Now, let's think about how declination works. There are three possible hypotheses about how declination could work. One is declination goes all the way. The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother. You declination all the way down. That doesn't happen. But it's a good hypothesis. The second one is you do reset. The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother. That also doesn't happen. Let me put on the board the three hypotheses. The three possible hypotheses are, number one, declination includes the parenthetical. So we have declination all the way down. The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother. That's not the natural reading of that. Second hypothesis, reset happens at the parenthetical. The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother. Also doesn't happen. The third one, the parenthetical is invisible. Let's see if that's right. And now I'm going to do a magic trick for you. We're going to go into Prat. We'll see how well this trick works. You know, they're amateur magicians. It's okay. But let's look at this. See how well this works.
The book on the table, if I recall correctly, was a gift from my mother.
Okay? Now let's just cut out the parenthetical.
If I recall correctly. If I recall correctly.
Let's try that.
If I recall correctly.
Just cut that out, yeah?
If I recall correctly.
I'm not doing this very clean, but let's try that. Now let's listen.
The book on the table was a gift from my mother.
Okay, I have a little bit of a mess there. Let's take out that mess.
The book on the table was a gift from my mother.
We have a Lee there.
The book on the table was a gift from my mother.
Okay, that was the version with the parenthetical snipped. Now let's play the one that I recorded without the parenthetical.
The book on the table was a gift from my mother.
Could you tell those apart blindfolded? I swear to you, I recorded these one after another. No, you can even hear the noise in the kitchen while I was recording that. You know, I have no tricks up my sleeve. The human brain somehow seems to insert parentheticals. I mean, we can do a much better experiment where you record me saying one today and then you record me a week later saying the other without the parenthetical. Compare them. It's incredible. The human brain seems to insert the parenthetical without messing with the rest of the declination. The only way to understand this, Ladd contends, is to have recursion there. Is to have the book on the table was a gift from my mother. Take that, temporarily expand it, and put in the middle another little chunk with its own global declination. That's our recursion. Okay. Comments or questions? Do you believe the argument? What do you think of the argument that parentheticals constitute a case of recursion in intonation? It's like they're hidden, it's like they're in a third dimension, it's like they're invisible, yes. But in order to say what that means, we sort of, they're still coming out of the same Adam's apple. They're still being sent linearly to the same demands, and somehow we're still keeping track. And this is just like a relative clause, right? The cat that John said was under the table is fuzzy. Somehow I'm able to maintain the fuzziness predicating of the cat with all of this junk in the middle. Nobody says the relative clause is invisible. They say it's recursion. That's Ladd's argument from 1986. It's been very underappreciated. People say, oh, recursion, syntax, 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 then a footnote. Ladd said there might be some recursion in phonology, but footnote, end of footnote. But this is very serious evidence. I think that it's amazing. Once you record for yourself the examples, go home, go to Pratt, and say, o livro na mesa, se eu não me engano, foi presente da minha mãe. O livro não foi presente da minha mãe. O livro, se não me engano, foi presente. Take out the se não me engano, it's going to be exactly the same. It's like your brain remembers exactly where it should have been, the same way that it does with the pitch, that it has to do with theta rolls connecting subjects to predicates with the relative clause in between.